Good evening and welcome to the Spirit Alive mini course focused on the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of John. My name is Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, which is a ministry supported by my congregation, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. We're glad you could join us for this course. Just a few announcements before I introduce our guest. Every presentation is recorded, and within approximately 72 hours, the recording is posted on Spirit Alive, our Spirit Alive channel, YouTube channel. So if you miss an evening, or if you want to listen to a presentation again, you can go back to the recording. But please remember that it takes a little bit of time for the recording to be edited and put up. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box anytime that you want throughout the presentation. Professor Schneiders will answer as many as possible at the end of her presentation. Some of you have written and asked why we do a webinar platform where you can't see each other and the speaker can't see you as opposed to a Zoom. Well, we have 250 people registered for this class tonight. Now, I know sometimes people are in different countries and they will watch it in the recording at a time that's convenient for them. But when we have over 50 people, we tend to avoid the distraction of having everybody appear in a tile on a screen. However, when we get to the Q&A, in addition to the questions that you can submit anonymously or with your name on them in the Q&A box, Matthew will invite you to open your video and your mic, and then you can raise your hand and be acknowledged. I will acknowledge you, and you can direct your question to Professor Schneiders. Okay, thank you. So it's an honor and really a pleasure to present Sandra Schneiders, IHM, a member of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary of Monroe, Michigan, where she now resides. Professor Schneiders is a biblical scholar and theologian. She attained a Licentiate in Theology from the Institut Catholique, Paris, and a Doctorate in Theology from the Gregorian University, Rome. In the course of an illustrious career teaching and researching, Professor Schneiders authored 14 books and published numerous articles in scholarly journals. She is an Emerita Professor of New Testament Studies and Christian Spirituality at the Jesuit School of Theology, Santa Clara University, and Berkeley, where she began teaching in 1976. Professor Schneiders specializes in New Testament literature, particularly Johannine literature, biblical hermeneutics, and Christian spirituality, specifically biblical spirituality, feminism, religious life, and the theory of the field of spirituality. In 2014, she received the Barry University Yves Congar Award for Theological Excellence. In 2013, she was honored with the Monica Helwig Award from the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities for outstanding contribution to Catholic intellectual life. In the year preceding, 2012, she received the Outstanding Leadership Award given annually by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Professor Schneiders has been working with Mary Colo, an Australian New Testament scholar who also specializes in the Fourth Gospel, to publish her original study on the Gospel of John, chapter 20. She has also contributed a chapter entitled Christian Spirituality in an Age of Uncertainty to a collection of essays entitled Resurrection and Contemporary Spirituality, which was just published earlier in 2026 by Paulus Press, and you can buy a copy. I am most grateful to Sandra for graciously agreeing to spend these 5 Monday evenings with us. I know from the high volume of registrants that an eager audience waits to be enlightened by you. So please, Sandra, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And hello to all the people I can't see out there. I haven't really adjusted completely to this speaking into a visual void after 35, 40 years of talking to live audiences with people I could see. This mini course on the resurrection is the very center of our faith. It is an enormous topic on which I spent several years of my life writing a doctoral dissertation. So to try to boil it down into a couple of presentations is more than a challenge, to put it mildly. But what I want to do, just to give you an idea of an overview of what I'm trying to do, so you can see where tonight's presentation fits into this, because we're not really going to get to the Johannine text on the resurrection of Jesus, which is in John 20, until our fourth session. So the fourth and fifth sessions, we will be dealing with the text of John's Gospel on the resurrection, which is John 20. And the first three sessions, I'm going to be talking about the role of the resurrection as revelation in the whole overall reality of Christianity. And I think most people of a certain age, at least, know that while we have always made a great deal of Christmas and the birth of Jesus and the public life of Jesus and so on, the resurrection has received relatively little attention, whereas the whole gospel leads up to the resurrection, and the resurrection is the revelation of the New Testament. So we're going to be spending three sessions tonight and next week and the week after on three aspects of this notion. Tonight we want to look at resurrection as the revelation, that is the self-manifestation of God in human history, that is the key to Christianity. Okay, so the first three sessions that we're going to do, the one today is, I want to talk about the resurrection, the role of the resurrection in Christianity. The resurrection is the center of Christianity. It's the source of revelation in Christianity. And it has been. Any Christian who goes to church every Sunday and so on will know that until quite recently in our Catholic Christian history, the resurrection has been kind of a little coda at the end of Jesus' public life and his passion, which are very dramatically presented. And then the resurrection is to kind of clean up the mess that was caused by the crucifixion. And that's really backwards. That everything in the New Testament is building up to the resurrection. The resurrection is the revelation. And so we're going to start with that assumption. And so we're going to be talking about how resurrection is really the key to Christianity. It's what's specific about Christianity. It's not morality. It's not the order in the church and so on. It's resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus, which becomes the revelation to us, which brings about eventually our resurrection, which is what we're headed for. That's what we mean by salvation. And then we're going to be looking at how revelation is mediated to us by Scripture. So Scripture is not just the book of information about how to be a Christian. It's the mediator of our experience of salvation. And then thirdly, we're going to be talking about, in the third week, theology and spirituality in the fourth gospel. So how these two join hands to initiate us into the experience that Jesus' first disciples had. And then we'll spend the last 2 weeks, the first one dealing with the first two pericopes, or little short stories, in John 20. And you might be wanting to be reading and meditating on chapter 20 of John over the course of the time that we're involved in this mini course. And then the last week will be the second two pericopes, that is the second two episodes in John 20. So we're dealing with, as far as the text is concerned, with the second last chapter of John's Gospel. And most people think that chapter 21, the last, is a kind of appendix to the Gospel. So the chapter 20 is the meat and potatoes of the resurrection account, which is the culmination of the Gospel as a whole. So I hope that can help. I know everybody here is not a scripture scholar and maybe has not had specific courses on either scripture or John in particular. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we're doing here. And the basic message of our whole experience together is that the center of Christian life is not the crucifixion of Jesus or even the public life and his parables and so on. At the very center of Christianity that makes it different from all other religions is our belief in the resurrection, that we don't come to an end when we die, and heaven is not just a place for us to relax after all the effort we put in, but that we were created for resurrection. We were created to become with God, living eternally, in the vision of God, in the presence of God, in the love of God, that everything in Christianity is oriented to resurrection. And resurrection is one of the least developed themes probably in most people's religious upbringing. And so we're going to hopefully balance that a little bit. So why this topic of resurrection as the key to Christian spirituality? Not suffering, not self-sacrifice, not ministry, not any of the other things that have been presented as the center of our religion. Why is resurrection the key to Christian spirituality? The originality of Christianity, what makes it different from all other religions and so on, really consists in our faith in the resurrection. And what that faith means, what it consists in, is our conviction that death is not the end of human existence. And we may not even realize that we think this, that we're doing all the important things that we have to do between our birth and our death. And if you did them right, you go to heaven and can enjoy things forever. And if you did them wrong, you go to hell, where you don't enjoy anything. But actually, we might say that the really interesting part of the whole thing starts with our death. Resurrection is the end of what we were created for, is to live eternally as risen in the presence of the risen Jesus, and in the reality that his whole life, passion, death, and so on, originated, where we can share in God's life for all eternity. So the definitive overcoming of human death is the originality of Christianity. I want to say that again because it's crucial to everything we're going to be saying, that the definitive overcoming, the final, unreversible overcoming of human death, the end of death, the death of death, is the originality of the Christian message. And it's the only religion that, in fact, carries that message. And we believe this because we believe that Jesus, who's the incarnation of God, so Jesus is the complete revelation of God. And if we want to know who God is, what God intends for us, what God means in the universe, we look at Jesus. We can't look at God. God is invisible. We look at Jesus to find out what it's all about. What it's all about for us, what it's all about for the universe, what it's all about for the cosmos, what it will be all about for all eternity, whatever that concept means. That we will not die, We will participate in the life of God eternally. And the problem is that probably most Christians really don't process this very well intellectually for all kinds of reasons. But one of them is that the teaching on the subject has been, well, shall we say, at least wanting in many respects down through the ages. People know a great deal more about the public life of Jesus, about the crucifixion of Jesus, than they do about what it was all about, which was the resurrection. So what I want to try to do is make the resurrection a little more functional in our lives. And that's the whole purpose of this mini course. It's not to cover all the stories about the resurrection or even the theology and so on. I want to try to push the resurrection into the front place in our consciousness with regard to our religious experience. And so I'm going to be asking questions about what is it that we really believe about the resurrection. And it's not simply that Jesus woke up in the grave on Easter Sunday morning and said, I'm out of here, and came out, left behind a few things, and went off to tell everybody that he was back. And that version of the resurrection as a kind of epilogue or a kind of wrap-up scene to what really was important, which was his life, his preaching, his parables, his death, and so on. What's really most important is the resurrection. And to see what the implications are if we actually believe that we were made for resurrection. And the resurrection is not a way of reversing the crucifixion. Everything up to the resurrection was meant to help us understand the resurrection. I think we can say that, and we know this increasingly now in our own time, that being a good person is not a matter of being a Christian or being a Catholic or being this or being that, that people can be good persons, can be successful human beings for all kinds of religions, for all kinds of reasons, without believing what we believe as Christians, or even believing that there is such a thing as eternal life. But being a Christian, not a good person, being a Christian means believing in the resurrection of Jesus, and that Jesus made this resurrection. Now, resurrection meaning victory over death. We don't have any firsthand experience of victory over death. Death is the end for every person, one by one. And the end of death is what we mean by the resurrection. It's revealed in Jesus, who's the only person who's experienced it so far. So what we're really kind of doing in this mini course here is trying to ask ourselves, what do we believe about the resurrection? What's the significance for us in our life, in our behavior, and so on? Does death have the final word when all is said and done, when it's all over? Is death the end of the story? And of course, as Christians, we believe that that's not the case. But when you ask people what they think resurrection is about, a lot of times what you find is in their imaginations is much closer to what we would call resuscitation. That the body died, the spirit of the person departed, we have a funeral, we bury the person, and at some time in the future, at the end of the world at least, if not before that time, that somehow this self, this body, is going to be resuscitated. And whether or not anybody would say that out loud is another question, but in the imagination of an awful lot of Christians, that is what they're thinking of when they think of resurrection, that we get our bodies back and we begin to be able to do the things that we could do when we were here. That's one wrong notion of resurrection. Another is that this is not as common among Christians as in some other religions, that somehow our soul or our personality, our self, exits from our body at death and is reincarnated in some other body, the later body, whether we're talking about reincarnation or the transmigration of souls, but that if there's anything of us that doesn't die when we die, it goes somewhere else and has another span of life of some kind. Another way of thinking about what happens to us at death is that while we go out of the picture, we're not here anymore, we're dead. The cause that we gave our life to, the values that we held, the hopes that we had for the human race, that project continues, that goes on. So Martin Luther King may have been shot, he may be dead, but the cause of racial equality and so on goes on, is taken up by other people. And so we don't entirely go out of existence, but we personally have, as it were, handed on the baton to the people who come after us, and particularly to people that we've had particular influence on, like our children or the younger generation that we've been teaching and so on. Another version of what might happen to us at death is that we're taken up into or transformed into or begin to participate in some kind of cosmic energy, that there's a kind of power for good, power for creativity and so on that is operative in the universe as a whole. And so while I may personally, in my particular body and my identity as Sandra Schneiders, I may go out of existence in that form, but all the good that I've done, the energy that I've put into the human project and so on, this is going to go into a kind of pool of cosmic energy. The world will be, we sometimes say, the world will be a better place because this person lived. They've infused reality in a way that has moved things forward for whatever will come next. Or in some contexts, people think of their ongoingness. They're not wholly dying in terms of their children, that they have produced children who will have an influence for good in the universe long after the parents are dead. Or that our works, whatever valuable things that we've done, whether it's been inventiveness or contribution to medicine or scientific progress, or that we've contributed something to the universe we're leaving it a better place than it was when we entered it. We made a contribution of some kind. Now, when we ask, what do we Christians believe? What do we want to understand? We believe that Jesus, this actual individual human being, first century Jew, Jesus, who really lived, he's not an ideal or a model for us and so on. He really lived in first century Palestine. He really had a career of teaching and healing and so on, and he was really put to death by his enemies. He was crucified. He was nailed to a cross. He died. We believe that he's alive with God in the full integrity of his humanity. This is really important, that Jesus is not a kind of semi-ghost or spiritual presence or energy in the cosmos and so on. Jesus is a real human being, and he remains a real human being through his death and into his resurrection, so that today, and I'm sure you've noticed, there are a lot of Christians who get kind of embarrassed and uneasy if people refer to Jesus. They'll talk about the Christ or the cosmic Christ or various ways of talking about, but it's like Jesus was a man who lived in the first century, and when he died, he ceased to be a human being walking around on two legs. And so they're okay with the Christ, especially the cosmic Christ, something like that, but they get very nervous when you talk about Jesus as present in my life, me relating to Jesus, not to the Christ or the Messiah or the Redeemer and so on, but this person, Jesus. So what we believe, what we mean when we say that we believe in the resurrection is that this Jesus, this real human being who really lived, who was born in and lived in first century Palestine, who really died, and he was really dead after his crucifixion, that he rose from the dead as a human body person, not as a spirit or a general climate or whatever, and that he's living right now in and among us and will be doing that, precisely that, now and forever. Now, what would be some implications if we actually believed in this? Well, for one thing, Jesus' mysticism would be a lot more easy for us to process and even desire to participate in if we really believe this, that Jesus' mysticism, such as Teresa of Avila is a good example of, that the religious presence at the center of our religious experience is Jesus, this real human being, this real individual human being. And that carrying on from that implication is that when we talk about acting in persona Christi, when we talk about acting as the real presence of Jesus in the world today, we're not talking simply about a Christic presence or I don't know how else to put it, but that we are making Jesus present in the world. Now, Jesus is no longer now limited by physically based determinations like age and sex and gender. That's one reason why a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about Jesus, because it seems that you're talking about a male who was not a female. We're talking about someone who didn't live into what we call adulthood. He only lived till he was 30 years old and so on. So when I say we want to think about the resurrection, that we're really talking about the resurrection of Jesus, not the resurrection of the Christ or the cosmic Christ or universal energy and so on. So how do I want to go about this in this little mini course that we have going here, to trying to open up for you some paths of reflection and prayer that will lead you into the mystery of the resurrection as it occurred in Jesus and as it will occur in our experience. So that's the whole point of the course, is on the resurrection, that the resurrection wasn't that simply that Jesus became an ongoing presence of some sort in human history, but that he, the real person, the human being who was born in a particular place with particular parents and so on, is really alive and present among us here and now today. So resurrection is not something that we can see with our bodily eyes, and it's not something that we can reason to from the available evidence. It's strictly speaking what we call revelation. And revelation means not something that we can experientially verify. It means something that is communicated to us as truth, as what's really real, and that it's given to us as a gift, and it comes from outside our realm of experience. In other words, it's not something that humans thought up and codified and taught to other people and so on. It's something that has been given to us, inserted into our experience. And so we need to talk about how we experience it, what it does to us, and so on. And the second thing, so that's the first thing. The second thing is we want to see how the resurrection of Jesus is revealed, how it was revealed and is revealed to us. And for that, we're going to use two sets of resources. And I want to introduce some ideas, and this will give your brain some calisthenics for a bit, to introduce some ideas from the philosophy of knowledge that is called in the Academy phenomenology, which is a way of understanding in modern terms what we mean religiously by the term revelation. It has to do with what shows itself, what reveals itself, what enters our experience from outside of ourselves, and which we're able to assimilate, to take in, to incorporate into our experience, our understanding, and so on. And then for most of our time together, I want to lead you through a kind of prolonged meditation on chapter 20 of John's Gospel, which you may want to take as your spiritual reading for a bit while we're doing this little mini course, because that's where John, the fourth evangelist, tells us about the resurrection, reveals to us what the resurrection really means. That's John's resurrection narrative. But before we get to that, to the actual text and so on, I want to talk about the reality of resurrection as revelation. So resurrection meaning the reemergence into the world in the history of somebody who's really died, not somebody who's in a coma and woke up and so on, but somebody who's really died, and that is revelation. That is, it's a communication to us of something that is not available to us by our own reasoning powers. It's something that's given to us as a gift. When someone says to you, "I love you," that's revelation. There's no way you can figure out whether somebody loves you. There's no way you can demand it or create it. When someone loves you, they are revealing themselves to you as essentially in relationship to them. And that comes as gift, as pure gift. So I want to talk now about, I always have to keep myself tied to my watch because I get wound up and take too much time with things. I want to say, talk about the revelation, the resurrection of Jesus as revelation, not something that was the natural outcome of what happened to him or anything else. It comes to us as revelation. But first, I want to do a little overview of how the rest of this course is going to proceed and what we're going to try to get to. So the first thing I want to be talking about tonight is resurrection as revelation. So in other words, not resurrection as the resuscitation of a physical corpse, but as how God has communicated to us what we could not possibly have come to about our own destiny, about the destiny of the world. What is known only to the mind of God is revealed to us in the resurrection of Jesus. And then in session 2 next week, we want to look at the revelation as mediated by Scripture. What's the role of this book that we call Scripture in allowing us to grasp this concept of revelation and its meaning, its content, what it's all about? And then in the third week, we'll try to get an overview of the theology and spirituality of the fourth gospel, which is the kind of outworking of this revelation. So looking at the theology and the spirituality of the fourth gospel, which is very different from that of the synoptics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's particularly available to us in the account of the resurrection in John. There are 2 chapters on the resurrection in John, chapter 20 and chapter 21. We'll be talking primarily about chapter 20. Most scholars believe that chapter 21 is of somewhat different provenance than the rest of the gospel. We don't want to get into all of that, but the meat and potatoes of what we want to talk about on resurrection is in chapter 20, and I strongly advise you to read it prayerfully and thoughtfully and even formulate your questions about it. And then the last two conferences will be on the 4 episodes in John chapter 20. There are 4 events that take place there. Each one is in a little mini story, and those 4 together constitute what we call the Johannine resurrection narrative. So you might want to read those 4 pericopes in John and spend some time meditating on it, the whole 4 together, and on the individual ones one by one. I have a couple books. If you're in a situation that has a religious library, you might pick up to help you unpack some things. I have several books on the resurrection that might be helpful to you. Now, the resurrection is a particular kind of phenomenon, and a phenomenon doesn't mean something that's extraordinary. Like we say, well, so-and-so is a phenomenon. We mean so-and-so is something really extraordinary. But the real meaning of phenomenon is a phenomenon is something that happens, that appears. That's what the Greek word that is behind it comes from. Something that appears, like a car crash. It happens. Or I should say not like a car crash, or something that happens. Nor is it like a formula, something that we could add and subtract and multiply and divide and find out the answer. Or a recipe, a cookbook recipe. We're talking about something that manifests itself, and that's where the word phenomenon comes from. Something that phenoms, something that happens, that appears, and we're particularly interested in something that appears that is called revelation. So it's something that we couldn't reason to, that we couldn't ferret out for ourselves, and so on. So we want to spend some time this evening talking about what we mean by revelation. It's not being told information that we couldn't otherwise have access to. It's something sui generis. It's something in a class by itself. If it's truly religious and truly experienced, rather than some kind of theological theory or somebody's teaching or some practice of obligations or some rituals that we perform or some practices that we have or rules that we keep and so on, these are not the central realities of Christianity. What's central to it is what God has revealed to us of God in the person of Jesus. So revelation is not the communication of otherwise unavailable information. And this is what we often think of, that something we couldn't have figured out for ourselves, something's not written down in any place, that something is revealed, it's unveiled, it's made available to us. But revelation communicates meaning. Let me say that again, that revelation communicates meaning, not facts or plans or duties or so on. And we know this, if we meet somebody who becomes terribly important to us, that all of a sudden everything in our experience changes, that we're filled with realization that we didn't have before. Our own self-image, our God image, our relationships, our understanding of the natural world and so on, are modified, not through the communication of data, that I learned something about gravity that I didn't know before. Revelation happens to us, and when it happens to us, it overwhelms us, and we know that that something has happened to us. That we know that we are more. It's not just that we know more, but that we are more. We are enlightened, in a way, illuminated. Our experience is reinterpreted for us. Different things are significant to us, and they're significant in different ways. Now, we may formulate ideas afterwards to clarify it and to communicate it to other people, but when revelation happens to us, it changes us. Falling in love is a supreme example of revelation. And it'd be very hard to sit down and write an essay to explain exactly what I came to understand when I fell in love. We do come to understand all kinds of things very differently, but it's because we have become a different person. I'm going to make use of, in order to unfold this idea of revelation, of the work of a contemporary Catholic phenomenological philosopher theologian. Now, these are big words that don't occur in our ordinary language, but they can be extremely illuminating, and I'll try to make them as clear as I can. And you don't have to understand the philosophy to grasp its implications any more than I have to understand gravity in order to know how to walk on the ground. There are certain things that structure our experience in such a way that whether we understand them or know how to name them or what, they are influencing us in fundamental ways. But I just want you to know that there is, in fact, all kinds of writing about this and so on. His name is Jean-Luc Maron. He's a French Harris, and he has taught at the University of Chicago in this country. And I want to make use of two correlative ideas or categories from Jean-Luc Maron's work that might help us with our understanding, because eventually what I'm going to be saying is that the resurrection of Jesus is fundamentally revelation. It's not a unusual act that he did, popping out of the tomb and so on. So we've got to get it into its proper category, which is revelation. And one of Marion's insights is that revelation occurs in or through our encounter or our involvement with what Marion calls saturated phenomena. Now, this language, in fact, is very illuminating, but it can be a little hard because it's unfamiliar to us in our ordinary speech. And we're going to discuss that but you know what saturation, if you dump over a glass of water and there's a towel sitting on the table, the towel gets saturated. It doesn't get damp or even wet. It gets saturated. And a phenomenon is simply something that arises in our experience, something that shows itself to us. So it's not something we cause, it's not something that we reason to, it's not something that we invent or construct. A phenomenon is something that arises in our experience. So the person who says, you know, tonight I fell in love. They're not talking about something they thought about and decided that, yes, this person is a good candidate and so on. It's something that arises in their experience. So revelation is usually simultaneously overwhelming and banal. Now, this is part of the marvel of the reality that we call revelation, but it's also difficult to grasp, because usually when we think of something that's overwhelming, it's something that blows us away. You know, and the banal is by definition the ordinary. I mean, this is a very banal reality. It's a glass of water. Okay, it's not like an appearance of the risen Jesus or something like that. So revelation doesn't usually come to us in the form of information or facts or data. It comes to us in the form of meaning, of significance, of insight, of conviction, of being overwhelmed by reality. So a good example of revelation is falling in love. All of a sudden, everything in a person's life is relativized, changed, put in relationship to other things. And when they're in the height of the experience of falling in love, they can do very strange things. It changes everything. And at the same time, and this is the banal part, banal means ordinary, everyday. There's nothing more banal than a computer mouse or a glass of water. And that combination of the overwhelming character of that is at the same time entering our experience in a very ordinary sort of way. And I want to illustrate how this simultaneous mind-blowingness and ordinariness coincide in a bit by reading with you a passage on the resurrection that's not from the Gospels. Now, the third thing I want to discuss for a bit is the notion of a saturated phenomenon. A phenomenon simply means something that appears. It's from the Greek, but and usually we use it when it's something kind of extraordinary that appears. But anything that appears, this mouse, the glass of water, my glasses, anything that can enter your experience through your ordinary senses and so on is a phenomenon. Now, we tend to use the word to denote extraordinary things that enter our, things that blow, we say, blow us away. But at this moment, I am a phenomenon to you, not because I'm extraordinary or different or whatever, but simply because I'm appearing in your experience. Now, you might have known before you turned on the computer who was going to be speaking tonight, but I was not at that point a phenomenon to you, unless we had met someplace else. But so everything in the room that you're in is a phenomenon. That is everything in the room that you know is there. So my words are a phenomenon. Even your own thoughts are a phenomenon to you. So anything that we experience that appears or arises in our experience is a phenomenon. And in the room, these are not phenomena because they're not experienced by us. At least I've never had an experience of my guardian angel. Maybe you have. But something as unreal as a dream, a bad dream, is a phenomenon. Now, it's not a phenomenon of a murder, but it's the phenomenon of me being scared by a non-existent murder that occurred in my dream. Nightmare, when the parents, there are no ghosts, there are no goblins, they don't even exist. She might as well be talking to the air, because the child has experienced a phenomenon that has impacted them, and they're scared skinny. So in other words, the parent is trying to tell the child what you are experiencing is not real. And by definition, an experience is real. Now, it might not be an experience of something that's real. There may not be a ghost that the child thinks they're experiencing. But the nightmare is absolutely real. So the nightmare is a phenomenon in the life of the child. But there are some phenomena, some things that appear in our experience that are so extraordinary in their magnitude, their beauty, or their terror, or their significance, either in themselves or because of the role they play in my life. There's some phenomena that are overwhelming. The death of a parent, for example, doesn't have the same effect on my friend who didn't even know my father who died. But in my life, this is a phenomenon which overwhelms me. So phenomena can be outside of us. It can be experienced by others as well as me together. They can be overwhelming while somebody else is completely unaware of them. So somebody who's fallen in love and keeps their mouth shut about it might be having an extraordinary phenomenon that their closest friends have no idea about. An example I thought of was, I was trying to think of how to illustrate this. If I go to the doctor and I get a diagnosis that I have cancer, and that it's probably in its advanced stages, that's an overwhelming experience for me, but it's not objective in the sense that everybody who's anywhere around would be similarly affected by it. It's an overwhelming phenomenon in my experience. Now, 9/11, just the fact that we referred to it by a state rather than a name or anything, 9/11 was an experience, a phenomenon that was shared by not only the people who were at ground zero that day, not only by Americans, but all over the continent and probably all over the world, without any kind of communication equipment. In other words, there was something objective about a phenomenon. Okay? A phenomenon is not simply an illusion. The illusion could be a phenomenon for me, but I am in could very well not exist at all. Okay? It could be simply a projection. So this difference between subjective and objective, and this is pertinent to the resurrection of Jesus, how much of it was objective, how much subjective. Now, this is really important. So when we're talking about religious experience, because we have all grown up in a Cartesian world, that is a world influenced by the philosopher Rene Descartes, and in the world of the scientific revolution, and in the world of the Enlightenment, and whether we ever studied any of these philosophies or science or so on, we've learned to place a lot of emphasis on what we call objectivity. Something's objective if it's out there, if it's not generated by my subjectivity, if I'm not projecting it. We say it's out there. So this mouse is objectively a piece of electronic equipment. It's not in the kitchen. It's not in the living room. It's on my desk. And if somebody else were here with good vision and so on, they would see what I see. Now, this kind of objectivist epistemology, that is a theory of knowledge that's based on the assumption that the really real are objective things. They're things that are outside of us that anybody who is present would see. That theory is precisely one of the things that phenomenological philosophers like Jean-Luc Marion are calling into question. And that's a great development for those of us who are interested in religious experience. Things like revelation, things that aren't sitting out on a desk where you can pick them up and hand them to somebody and say, this thing is called a mouse, and so on. Because revelation is the kind of thing that you can't take it out and put it on the desk and point to it and say, that's what I mean by revelation. I can say, that's what I mean by a mouse. It's an objective reality. It looks the same to you as it looks to me. But when I start talking about revelation, it's not in that category. Sometimes you can't even establish that that what I'm talking about actually exists. So the objectivist will ask, for example, whether if somebody besides Mary Magdalene had been in the Garden of the Resurrection, would that person have seen the risen Jesus? And if not, then was Jesus really there? Did Mary imagine it or project it so that it's not really real? And that's the issue we're dealing with in regard to the resurrection, because our knowledge of the resurrection comes to us who were not alive in the first century by witness, by people who did experience something telling us that they experienced it. But if they were simply having subjective experiences, unreal experiences, and they testified to it, do you see what that does to the solidity of our faith, of our personal experience of Jesus as risen? So I want to just give you two examples of what philosophers have come to call saturated phenomena, because that's what the resurrection is that we're going to talk about. One of the examples is somewhat objective in that a lot of people had the experience at the same time of the same thing, and they agreed about its shape and its content and its effects and so on. And one, which is not the experience of anyone, but only of the one who had it. And we might be tempted to say that an experience that is only available to the person who had the experience is purely subjective. That is, it has no real existence in the world. It's a condition of the person who had the experience. And 9/11 was, for many Americans, a good example of a public or an objective, what Mario called saturated phenomenon. It simply blew us away. It exhausted our capacity for experience. We couldn't even imagine somebody attacking our country in that way. And it threw us into all kinds of questions about what protects us. Do we have any real reality as a country, and so on. And we're still trying to figure out what happened and whether it could happen again. So this phenomenon, this event, it was mind-boggling. We actually used that word. We were like zombies in mortal danger at all times. Now, I want to take another event. If you think about the delivery room in a hospital, a father is in there, a married man, and he's watching his wife give birth to their first child. And when he sees this child come into the world, a child now, not a mysterious protrusion of his wife's stomach that he imagined had something in it and so on, or not a shadow on a sonogram, or a thumping in a stethoscope, but a freestanding, not standing yet, lying, living human being that is his child, not just a child, but a being who never existed before, and that new reality is his child. So he, without doing anything, or he is something that he never was before. He is a parent. He's a father. He's responsible for something, for a human being who will be totally dependent on him for years. He has no idea what this child will become. He didn't plan it. He didn't order the child that I want this kind. He didn't even know what sex the child was going to be. And so he has this huge life responsibility. How will he cope with this? What will be the effect on his wife? Will his wife love him, continue to love him as much as she loves his child that she just produced? So the sheer magnitude of life, of creation out of nothing, the overwhelmingness of love that he's never felt for anything before, this teeny little creature, that he would give his life in the bat of an eyelash for this tiny bit of totally inexperienced, minutes-old human life. So the experience of becoming a parent is absolutely personal. He could compare it with other men who've had a similar experience, but there's no way anyone could share his actual experience. That's the kind of thing we were talking about as a communal experience in the experience of 9/11. But there's absolutely no doubt about the experience. If somebody said, well, I, who lived in Australia, I didn't have anything comparable to your experience, so it probably wasn't that way. We know that this saturated phenomenon, which overflows with meaning and drowns out everything around it, is absolutely real. And at the same time, there's a banality about experience, that how many men have experienced their child being born and realized that they were a father? You say, it's the most common experience in the world. So you have this double, the phenomenon, you have this double experience of something that's sui generis, that blows you away, that's out of proportion to anything, and that's common. Think of all the men in the world who've become fathers. So this crossing of the banal and the absolutely extraordinary is characteristic of the phenomenon, and we sometimes use that experience. Or I mean, I don't mean experience, that expression. Now, another thing that I want to discuss, and we're working here on background material for saying what we want to eventually say about the resurrection of Jesus, which is a phenomenon, once in a lifetime, once in a world time experience, and so on. But we're building up some tools for doing that. I want to make a contrast also between two kinds of knowledge: objective, scientific, non-participative knowledge. This is the kind that we exalt in science, where there's no personal bias involved. I'm getting the facts, ma'am, just the facts. I put it in the test tube, I tested it. What I'm telling you about it is the truth. I'm not leaving anything out. I'm not putting anything in. This is the real McCoy. And we have a tendency to think that that's the most reliable kind of knowledge that there is. That it's the kind of knowledge that we don't participate in. And so I didn't add anything to it. I didn't change it. It's the way it is. And we've been taught to think that that's the most secure kind of knowledge. That's the most real kind. Nobody has a stake in it. Nobody is controlling it. It's the way it is. It's an object, and I'm a subject. And this subject knows that object, and I don't have to worry about it being my personal opinion or what have you. Now, phenomenological theory says that I'm not a freestanding subject in a world of freestanding objects, and that I take these phenomena into me just the way they are, with no I don't say that this is how it appears to me, or this is what I think. I say this is how it is. I want to skip some of this, but I hope you're recognizing what I'm describing, the way we understand knowledge, because our knowledge of the resurrection of Jesus is knowledge of a different kind than this objective, scientific, impersonal information gathering. Because there are different kinds of phenomena, different kinds of things that show themselves, that present themselves, not in terms of my using them or my ability to manipulate them for my purposes, but they impinge upon me. They come into my knowledge world. They take us over. They incorporate us into reality. I'm going to want to talk about things that are more important than objective realities of that nature, but rather things in my life that are not just there, that are not just objective, not just, but things that are phenomena to me, that are complex. They have feelings attached to them. They have independence from me. I'm not free to dispose of them in any way that I want or do anything that I want to them. And these are things that I discover only bit by bit. I come to know them as they give themselves to me. I'm afraid, I'm getting a signal here. I'm afraid that we're going to have to interrupt this at this point and take it up next week to get to the point that I really want to get to, of sorting out these things that come into our experience and the way we know them, in order to get to a point, which I'll tell you what the point is, so that when we take them up next week, you'll know what I'm talking about. That these phenomena, these things, this is a phenomenon. It's a glass of water. It's what it is. This is a mouse. It's what it is. But I want to be talking, and I'll start with that next week. I want to be talking about things that are not just there, things that I can consume, things that I can use, and so on. I want to talk about a different kind of phenomenon that I'm going to call a saturated phenomenon. So a thing, an idea, a relationship, a person, an event, and so on, that philosophers have come to call saturated phenomena. So they don't have just one meaning. They're not just there with doing the thing that they do, but they're overwhelming experiences. And that's what the resurrection of Jesus is. And that's what we're interested in spirituality, is our experience of these saturated phenomena. So if you can hold that in your mind until next week, and so we have time for some questions on what I've been saying so far, I think you can see what I'm doing. I'm trying to parse our experience in order to know where to place the experience that we call the resurrection of Jesus.
Thank you, Sandra. I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Matthew, do you want to invite people who would like to come in with their videos so they can raise their hands? And while you are doing that and letting people in, Sandra, here's a question. It's raised by someone, Patrick Madden, who says, Paul says the Lord is spirit, and he also says the last Adam, Jesus, became a life-giving spirit. How does this fit in with your stress on Jesus as fully human?
I'm sorry, but I missed the first part of your question, so I don't know what is bearing on.
So the point of the question is, St. Paul says the Lord is spirit, and he says elsewhere, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. How does this fit in with your stress on Jesus as fully human?
All right. Well, that's precisely the question that I'm trying to address in this. That this notion that Jesus became life-giving spirit. In other words, he becomes able to communicate in numerous ways with us, from within us as well as from without us. That something happened at the resurrection. Everybody kind of agrees with that. But what happened is the big question, and that's the thing that I want to address. So what happened? Did Jesus become a kind of ghost? So he kind of shucked off physicality, which he did, and so became unbodily and therefore unhuman? Or did his bodiliness become a different kind of bodiliness that allows him still to be in actual communication with us? And the point that I'm going to make, hopefully by the end of this, has to do with, I mean, you're jumping the gun on me, but that the resurrection is not turning Jesus into a ghost, because he wouldn't be Jesus.
Or a spirit.
He might be the spirit of Jesus. He might be the remembrance of Jesus, or a model. But I think what is so hard for us Christians in our scientific world to actually process, and it is the basis of a genuinely Christocentric spirituality, is that we're not dealing with a ghost on the one hand. We're not dealing with a purely historical figure who was real when he was real, but died and became something else. That we're talking about the real human, bodily, risen Jesus as a real participant in our real bodily human experience. And conceptualizing that, figuring out how to think about that, I think is one of the big challenges that Christian spirituality faces. And so we kind of dissolve Jesus into a kind of cosmic ether of some sort. He's a kind of force in the universe, or atmosphere in which we exist, or climate, that environment that he creates, and so on. And what the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, reveals to us, and which we resist, I think because we can't process it, is that Jesus, in the full integrity of his humanity, as his real self, Jesus was not a ghost. He was not a pure spirit. He was not an angel. He was not an ethos. He was not a climate. He was not a way of approaching the universe. He was a real, actual person.
Sandra,
But we don't know how to process that.
yeah, I don't want to interrupt you, but a couple of people want to know. It was Jean-Luc Mariol, Mariol,
I-O-N, Mario.
Ion,
Yeah,
Marion. Okay, so
Mario.
the two people who asked about that, that's Jean-Luc Marion. We have somebody who has their hand up, Steve Henry. Do you want to ask your question? Put your mic on, please.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what happened to him. Here's a question. Is Jesus's resurrection similar to the burning bush in the Hebrew Bible? Were there other experiences like the resurrection, or is it unique?
Well, the answer to the last one maybe helps with the other. It really is unique. I mean, it is the uniqueness of Christianity that we have no previous instances of it or examples of it or things that we can compare it to. And the fact that it's the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So it may well be, and it seems to be the case if we read literature, that people have experienced loved ones that have died and who have arisen in their experience, in their dreams, or in their decision-making processes, and so on. The resurrection is sui generis because what rose was Jesus, not Jesus' spirit or the ethos that he generated or a remembrance of him and so on, that Jesus himself, in the full integrity of his humanity, that is, as the bodily person, Jesus, is actually alive and among us now.
Okay.
And that's what's mind-boggling.
We're at 8:15. So just quickly, the four sections of John 20 that you were talking about, is that John 21 to 10, 11 to 18, 19 to 23, 24 to 29?
That's correct. And then at
Okay.
the end, there are two verses that sum up the whole gospel. These things were written that you may believe.
30,
So
31. Great.
that's
Now,
exactly the structure.
It's already 8:15. I like to end on time, but we have some quick questions here. If the people who have their hands up can can open their audio and speak up, that would be great. Thank you.
This is Pat Madden. My question is, how is there any analogy with what happened to Jesus and our Catholic cult of the saints? Like we talk about the Virgin Mary being assumed to heaven, or we talk about the saints, like my saint, Saint Patrick, being in heaven with Jesus. Is there some kind of analogy, or is it just completely, totally different?
Well, kind of both. So far as we know, and I think we can say, so far, nobody except Mary, the mother of Jesus, has participated in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And that's what creates the eschatological tension, our looking ahead to something which we have not experienced and which we will experience, and so on. There was something in your question, something else that was important to respond to. The resurrection of Jesus up to now is sui generis. We do not have other examples of it. And it's precisely what the church teaches. We will participate in the general resurrection, in the general bodily resurrection of the just. So Jesus has anticipated it. We have some idea of what it's about. but we don't have, and I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of people have an awful lot of problems with any kind of Jesus spirituality. They can deal with the Christ or the cosmic Christ or the kind of disembodied things and influences and so on. But the idea that we are headed for the same destiny that Jesus already embodies. So Jesus is not a ghost. He's not a disembodied spirit. He's not a whatever. He's really himself. And if he's himself, then he's his bodily self.
That's
Okay,
very helpful.
I think we're going to have to end it there. It's 8:20. I appreciate everybody's participation tonight. And Sandra, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. We're looking forward to your presentation next week. Be safe, everyone. And for a moment, let's pause and just remember what is going on in our world and ask the God of peace to help bring peace and to stop the suffering, the violence, and the killing of so many people, and to bring wisdom to our leaders, because our leaders have to bring us out of this darkness and chaos towards peace and light. Good night, everyone. See you next week.